Hi, I'm Greg Burnins, your Ghent town historian. Today's trip into Ghent history, we're going to get up close and personal with one of our brand new 5 Pomeroy Foundation historical markers. Before we go on a little walkabout, I want to talk a brief lesson, talk about the sources used, the 11 sources used to definitively prove the information on this sign. County home site. Well, we used 3 maps. 1858, 1873, and 1892 to show that this was in fact the spot of the county home. I'll drop a pic in here of the oldest of those maps. That's a detail from the 1858 Columbia County map. The dates. Well, you all know circa means about, and we weren't able to nail down exact year when it opened. We do have in the county clerk's office a record of the 1829 deed transfer between John and Margaret Hogeboom to the county of Columbia. I'll drop a pic in here. I did transcribe that for ease of reading. The 1836 New York State examination of poorhouses shows the home open in 1833. So, circa 1830 works just fine. The 1853 closing date comes from the Proceedings of the Board of Supervisors of Columbia County, which, by the way, makes for excellent bedtime reading. The approximate 150 residents, that comes from the average of the 1855 New York State Census, 1880, 1920, and 1940 federal censuses, which actually do make good bedtime reading. They list every resident of the county home, all the censuses do. So we averaged those numbers up and came up with 150. Some years it was more, some years it was fewer. The deed I mentioned a minute ago lists 199 acres, 3 roods, and 30 purchases of land. We did round that up to 200 acres. Barn sold in 1955. We know that because the Wilbur family had all of the meeting minutes of the Ghent Development Corporation, the group that bought the buildings, most of the buildings, and the land, and made it into the Ghent development. And the records clearly show that the barns, silos, and other farm buildings were sold for removal. Love to know if any of those are still around. And home burned in 1979. I found up in the files of the Chatham Public Library, the Ghent file, a newspaper article talking about the fire that burned the big building that was here, and describing it as really one of the coldest nights in Ghent history. So those are the primary sources, the oldest being 1829 and the newest being 1979, 11 sources to prove 6 lines of text. But that's why we always say, if it says William G. Pomeroy Foundation, you know it's right. But wait, let's walk around a little bit. So we've walked just about 50 feet from the marker toward one of the oldest buildings on the property. That brick building there right next to the Kleinkill is labeled on a number of the old maps as the Negro House. So that tells us that the county home was segregated. We assume white people were in the big building, and of course that building was reserved for African Americans, which is kind of interesting because just down the road the Ghent School, opened in 1878, was never segregated. So interesting to think about that segregation existed here in living quarters, but not for schooling, just a quarter mile down the road. Behind me was the big house. 2 very large wings, one wing for men, one wing for women. The basement of that building had the bakeries, the kitchen. Of course, the front of the building was more like a regular home, I guess maybe where people visited, probably where the superintendent's office was. But I'm going to drop another picture in here. Just to show how enormous the building was. And of course, many of you still remember it. And it's unfortunate that it burned when it did. It was actually in pretty good shape at the time. It would probably still be with us if it hadn't caught fire. So two of the essential buildings that actually housed the people who lived here, the Negro House and the main building, which again was right where the post office now sits. So one thing that's very important to remember that I don't even know if we have anything similar to it in society today, is that the people who lived here, the able-bodied, worked on the 200-acre farm. And as you look over my left shoulder, you see the Whitestone Cafe. But I'm going to drop a picture in here of what that looked like when the county home was here. Amazing, isn't it? To think that that Ghent development was all beautiful farmland, and with pigs and cows and workhorses. And over here in the woods is actually, it's still there, and you can see it when the leaves are off the tree, was the slaughtering house. So the county farm was self-sufficient. In fact, some years it actually made money for the county. So really, you know, obviously anybody who wound up here was down on their luck. Many of them had alcohol problems. But to have a farm to work on, to feel some sense of self-sufficiency was something anyway. Of course, the main building, all of the horrors of 19th century, 1850s, insane asylums took place there. We know that patients were whipped, they were tied to ball and chain. So a lot of the horrors that took place everywhere in American places like this, we know they happened here. I think in the 20th century it was much happier times. I've talked to some older people who were here as kids. The children of Frank Moore, who was the last farmer here, and they loved coming up here and going into the kitchen, and Jimmy Moore talked about sneaking a cookie, and the people who lived here were described as, you know, fairly content. So I do hope, in my mind, in my imagination anyway, that conditions over the time that the home was here certainly improved. So two of the four remaining buildings from the county home are behind me. Over my left shoulder is a building that was used for different purposes. At one point it was the hospital, at one point it was the insane asylum part, at another point it was labeled as the women's place. Today it of course is Countryside Furniture and is being very well cared for by its owners. And the building over my right shoulder for many years was the laundry, and that is rented out now to some artists and also in very good shape. So we're very fortunate. I think it'd be nice to have the big building, but we still do have four buildings, three of which are used and in excellent shape. So whenever you pass through here, drive carefully, but let your imagination roam. Imagine 100, you know, at one point 180 plus people living here in one or two buildings and walking across Union Turnpike, now Route 66, to work on the farm and working and doing the laundry and working in the kitchens. And it's really an unbelievable thing to think about a county farm, a county home, an almshouse, a poorhouse, right here in the hamlet of Ghent from 1830 up to the 1950s. And it would have been a key part of the Ghent hamlet, beginning with the Ghent train depot and the hay presses, right up through here and then on up to where we're headed next, up to Buckleyville and then on into the village of Chatham. It's a very, very busy place around, especially right around 1900 would have been the peak of activity. So if you want to learn more about the county home, of course you can pick up a copy of The Town of Ghent, 1818-2018. They're for sale at the Chatham Bookstore, Love Apple Farm, Ghent Town Hall, or contact me, Greg Berninger, your town historian. I'll make sure you get a copy. There's some more information there about the county home. Thanks for coming along today. And many, many thanks to our friend Butch Peaster, who owns the post office and the property that it's on, for letting us put the marker there. And of course, many thanks as always to the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, not only paying for the markers, but paying historians to check my work.